Okay, so let me hand over to Jonathan as chair of this session.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Dr. Tommy J. Curry, who's a professor of philosophy and holds the personal chair of Africana philosophy and Black male studies at the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Curry's work has earned him numerous awards, including the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy's Alan Locke Award in 2017, an American Book Award in 2018, and most recently, the Josiah Royce Prize for American Idealist Thought for his book, Another White Man's Burden, Josiah Royce's Quest for Philosophy of Racial Empire. Dr. Curry's talk today is titled, He's Not Worth It, the Deleterious Character of the Disabled Black Male.
Thank you so much for that introduction. This paper reflects some thinking I've been doing about how we theorize the Black male, specifically the disabled Black male within Black male studies. When we look at the literature on the disabled Black male body, we see that this is largely an under-researched area of thought and reflection. Most of our arguments about disability overwhelmingly focus on stigma. In fact, so much so that we currently do not have a comprehensive interpretive framework to really understand and engage questions of Black male disability in relationship to the driving concepts of Blackness, maleness, and death that we find to dominate other engagements. This was explored in 2017 by me in an essay called This Nigger's Broken, because I was really interested in how the Black male body is situated within the kind of misandric aggressions, the murderous and lethal violence and extermination that we see expressed towards Black males more generally. And in the literature, there weren't very many resources because the notion of able-bodiedness seemed to imply discrimination and inequality, right? Invisibility, distortion. But there wasn't a way to articulate why disabled Black men still experience the same kind of impositions and murderous rage and violence by police and others throughout society. Now, for many people, it's sufficient to say that Black men are simply feared and that disabled Black men are feared as well or feared in different ways. But that doesn't do the same kind of work that's necessary to explain concepts like sexual vulnerability, which I'll talk about in a little bit towards the end of the presentation, the expression of violence towards disabled Black men, despite the fact that they can't be physical threats, and the general disposition of erasure, where even in our concepts and thoughts, we don't see Black men as having a fundamental subject position by which we theorize. So when we look at previous research there that articulates Black disability, it usually does so from the sole view of experience or being perceived as or by others and whiteness. So I'm thinking specifically here of the work of Chris Bell, especially when he's in that essay, about 7 or 8 page essay where he's talking about doing representational detective work, and he's making the claim that we need to look at how other marginalizations like femininity, sizeism, etc., represent bodies in a way that they're lesser than other bodies. What I'm pushing, however, is a different lens or perspective. I want to ask, how do we deal with the problem of abnormality and what I take to be more abnormal? Now, in 2017, I argued that to be non-white is to be abnormal, or evolutionarily behind in the phylogenetic order of human development. So those who are race have historically been constructed as degenerate, inferior, non-human, opposite to the rational prototype of the human superior Western able-bodied human. Now, as an outgrowth of 19th century eugenics, degeneration became a compelling racial metaphor such that the colonized races were assumed to be intrinsically degenerate and as a result could never be improved. So degeneracy suggests a biological weakness and disease, often translating into attribution of diminished cognitive and rational capacities of non-white populations. Now, I take this to be a base or a grounding, so to speak, of how we theorize the disabled Black male body. So when we're talking about racism and negation, we don't start with a discrimination frame. And what I mean by that is most of our theories suggest that when we talk about Blackness or womanhood or queerness, etc., that these things are taken away from some sort of normative body. I'm suggesting that when we fix on the Black male body, it doesn't have those resources of humanity and recognition. So it requires a different way of articulating the vulnerability of disability. So in the West, sight analyzes the body and becomes the instrument used to identify biological deficiency, which is thought to indicate degeneracy and inferiority. In this circuitous epistemology, the deformity of the body is a reflection upon the supposed distortion of the mind, just as the distortion of the mind suggests savage degeneracy of the body. Now, this runs contrary to intersectional and representational lenses of theory. So the introduction of the Black male and the risks to his life are not arrested by disability. What I showed with the murder of Mr. McDowell in my first article on disability and subsequent conversations that I've had with the Black Disability Network is that disability operates within the nexus of death, right? So in the more normative case, the presumption of able-bodiedness is an obstacle to personhood and recognition for the white body. For the Black body, particularly the Black male body, however, there's a continuation of deleterious categories that burden all Black men, which is experienced, not as a separate condition, but as a different continuity of already burdened flesh. Now, the presumption of additional disadvantage, which we found in Bell's work in 2006 and 2011, as well as various intersectional interpretation of marginal identities, presume a causal relationship between how one identifies and how one is disadvantaged compared to other groups that do not possess such identifications. I think this is wrongheaded. When we're looking at the kinds of vulnerabilities, the kinds of marginalization that disabled Black men face, we find much more continuity in their relationships and conditions with other groups of Black men. Lower life expectancy, fear, hyper personality or character traits, right? These kinds of stigmas have to be filled in as the basis of the subject that we're talking about. I'm suggesting that if we start from the basis of humanity, that is ultimately wrongheaded. So then how do we understand this relationship that I'm trying to point to between Black maleness and disability and disposability? The first thing is that we have to understand that the conditions by which Black men exist, especially in the United States, are circumscribed, right, by anti-Black misandry. Now, some people say, well, what does this term mean? So anti-Black misandry is the cumulative assertions of Black male inferiority due to errant psychologies of lack, dispositions of deviance, or hyperpersonality traits like hypersexuality or hypermasculinity, which rationalize the criminalization, phobics, and sanctioning of Black male life. These ideas are part of the group-based racial consciousness of white America and part of the social fabric and mythology of racism. So in other words, we're all exposed to the notions of Black male deviance and danger. And these stereotypes then are held by whites or Blacks, white men, white women, other ethnic groups, or Black women. What we're identifying here is how the hatred of Black men is hidden by appeals to safety, civility, and democratic order, because he, the phantasm of the boogeyman in America, is thought to be a threat to all that is good, white, and woman. Now, I'm suggesting that Black males who are disabled don't interrupt or not experience this. So the question that I'm asking, right, on part of the deleterious character, is what is the relationship that disability has to the continuity of these kinds of stereotypes and forms of violence? Now, when we look at Black men, again, we're not looking at subjects that have recognition or civility as part of the package of their identity. When we look at different arguments, specifically social dominance theory, we see that the ways that Black men are outgroup men are formulated they're constructed as being in war, right, with the dominant group. So that means that racism operates to create subjects that are fundamentally separate from the notions of humanity, that are already outside of the moral communities that we identify as being synonymous with civil society. So arbitrary set discrimination then within patriarchal white supremacist societies operate as a form of discrimination that's really a form of intersexual competition perpetrated by males and directed against males. So as Sedanis and Prado suggests, arbitrary set discrimination can also be viewed as a form of low-level warfare directed against outgroup males. And these social dominance theorists label this a subordinate male target hypothesis. Taking it as the basis of how we have social organization and social interaction in the United States and other Western societies, that means that disabled Black men fit within the notions of groups or individuals that are constructed in opposition to white civility. So the Black male body then, contrary to what Bell is suggesting, doesn't operate simply as being a disadvantaged kind, but a dangerous kind, a disabled dangerous kind, a monstrosity. And this is what we see ignites not only the kinds of violence that we see with Mr. McDowell and others, right? But it also leads to the indifference that we have to not only perceiving how these bodies are tormented in society, but why we have no resources that actually deliver humanitarian recognition upon them. I'd like to lead with a few examples here. The first is Mr. Michael Hickson, who was left to die. Now, Mr. Hickson example speaks to the absence of humanity, which is black maleness and disability. Now, Mr. Hickson had pneumonia in both lungs, a urinary tract infection and sepsis, a dangerous immune response leading to multi-system organ failure. He needed a ventilator to help him continue breathing, but the hospital felt that further intervention for the disabled man was futile. A doctor explained to the family there was little hope Hickson would survive or regain quality of life. Now, throughout this story, and this became viral a few months ago, there was the question of whether or not this was because he was a black male and presumed to be dangerous, right? Where eliminating him was actually a benefit to society, or if it was a question of disability, how disabled peoples are constantly ignored, dehumanized, etc. Now, if we take seriously the idea that there is an absence of humanity from black maleness, I'm suggesting that disability operates within that nexus, that disability is not an addition, but it's a supplement to the dynamics by which black men are going to be rationalized as monstrosities, as uncivil, as savage, etc. And the question that we have to ask ourselves when we're talking about the black male body then is, how do disabled black men fit within these coordinates? What is it about disability that doesn't necessarily create a new causal relationship to absence or to dehumanization, but what magnifies or creates a different pathway towards it? We see the same thing, of course, with the shooting of Jeremy McDowell, right? Disabled black man, right? Asking for help, made a 911 call, was in distress. The police perceived him as a threat, and of course, killed him. Now, in 2017, when I reflected upon this, I argue that this is part of the problem with how we can't see disability as a category upon the black male. That because the black male represents so much predetermined savagery and violence, that there's no way to recognize disability as a meaningful concept given the subject position he occupies. So I argue that Mr. McDowell was murdered because the white officers rationalized him as a threat, a savage, and a danger to white life, despite his confinement to a wheelchair. He was denied vulnerability. He was denied victimhood. He was denied consideration as a human being in need of help. So, to correct such philosophical conceptualizations, there must be a focus on the actual effects disability has on black men and boys. So, if black males are to be overdetermined by the fear inspired caricatures of the society, then there must be philosophical interventions that convey the difference between the delusions of the white mind and the lived reality or the physical existence that black men and boys endure. So, understanding the relationship between violence and the black male body helps to clarify exactly what's denied to the disabled black male. And here, the question that I'm asking is very simple. If we already assume that there is savagery, dehumanization, and absence on the black male body, to what way does disability either contribute or take away those attributes? Is there a magnification effect where able-bodiedness somehow operates as a privilege? Well, historically, the notion of the able-bodied black man as savage has been related to either the criminal, the deviant, or the rapist. Does disability interrupt that? Well, if we have a particular reading of To Kill a Mockingbird, certainly it doesn't. So disability doesn't operate simply as an intersectional category that increases disadvantage. It may, in fact, contribute to a different experience or pathway of disadvantage. But what we have not done is theorized disability with the black male body and the supposition of violence as the basis for theorization. We see tons of different forms of historical violence. Emmett Till, for instance, on disabled black males, which presuppose able-bodiedness precisely because the racial stereotype of the of the rapist requires an able-bodied male to do so. But these are all constructions in the white mind. These are not facts about the body itself. So to disentangle the way that the category of disability actually operates on the physical body of black men and boys requires us to take a very different trajectory. Excuse me, to take a very different trajectory of how we're trying to line the concepts up. If we think disability takes away from humanity, but the humanity of black men are already absent and is constructed as a threat, then is there any work for the category of disability to do? I'm suggesting that there is, because we have the experiences of disabled black men to draw upon, but we also have to make serious categorical and philosophical questionings our attempts to understand the relationship that that disability has to the death drive, our death-bound subjectivity that we find with the black male body. I like to introduce John R.K. Howard, who was a white man who raped a mentally disabled black boy in an Idaho locker room. And this is what I mean about how the category of disability on the black male body resists certain interpretations. Now, Howard was tried and not convicted of sexual violence and assault. In fact, in the case itself, what happened was so sexually violent um, that the community launched a protest to get sexual violence added to and prosecuted for the victim. So the black male team was mentally disabled. Howard and a group of boys held the victim down in the locker room and shoved a coat hanger up his rectum. The whole coat hanger was then kicked into his rectum even deeper. Now, what's interesting is in the court, the judge actually said, look, we're not going to try the perpetrator for sexual violence. And this is despite the testimony of the victim actually describing how he felt during the attack, saying that it was a pain that I never felt, took over my body. I screamed, but afterwards I kept it to myself. So even disabled black men don't get the kind of recognition as victims of sexual violence and rape, despite the disability to able-bodied white men. Now, think about this relationship. In a world where black men can't claim that they're victims of rape because they're historically articulated or represented by the notion of the rapist, and disability becomes a vulnerability to the able-bodiedness of multiple white men that have racial animus driving them. How then do we operate with creating meanings for the disabled black male victim who is victimized by the racial animus of the white group, who is sexually victimized by the notions by groups of white men, right? But how do we create meaning for that? The judge refused to acknowledge that it was a crime of sexual violence. The judge refused to acknowledge that the black man was a victim of a gang rape by white men. So we're not just trying to claim something as being possible. We're not just trying to say, recognize that this was sexual victimization or violence. There's a way in which the vulnerability of disability and the vulnerability of being a black male makes some of those meanings and categories no, not possible, right? So the argument that I'm making in this paper is that disability for black men has been theorized very much from an intersectional feminist lens, where marginalized identities lead to certain forms of disadvantage that we should take seriously, but are ultimately based in identity and how one perceives this. What I'm suggesting is that when we look at black men, the fact that there is kind of acuity there associated with absence of humanity, negativity, criminality, and violence means that there aren't any resources of the subject that gives humanity or recognition. So disability on that body simply leads to more brutalization and non-recognition and dehumanization, rather than a possibility of actually being recognized as victim or incapable of harm. Said differently, because racism against black men requires a kind of superhumanism, that superhumanism carries with it a kind of essential notion of able-bodiedness, and that able-bodiedness overturns and overwhelms any sensibility of disability that could ever make someone recognize the black male subject as being different from the stereotypes and the dangerous notions they've already constructed in their mind. So thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. So right now we don't actually have any questions, but I actually do have one that emerged as you were concluding your talk. So one of your arguments is that the perception of the black male body as superhuman, as overdetermined by these racist narratives, obscures disability. And I want to think about this in a kind of institutional context wherein the difficulty for Black male students and Black students in general to attain disability accommodations can be grounded in the ways in which white institutional apparati do not view the disabled Black body as possessing a disability by virtue of, say, the embodiment of disability as being made manifest through racial logics. Is this kind of within the ambit of what you're talking about?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think I would just add that when you're speaking about the black male body, the kind of negativity that we've seen both through sexual vulnerability and victimization as well as threat constructions means not only that it's not registered, but it's contoured into a figment of danger, right? So vulnerability becomes an impossibility. And I think that what we've done in philosophy is we've given essential meanings to terms and categories like disability because we've operated on the notion that disability comes with certain stigmas and that it abrupts or is a barrier to seeing certain forms of humanity, right? um, what ends up happening with the black male body, however, is that because that body doesn't have the resources of humanity, disability operates to accelerate um, and emphasize certain aspects of caricature, be it violence, be it mental instability, be it savagery. So I think that white institutions and white individuals live off of the caricature of the black male, of the black male body, and disability simply operates within that schema. So marginalization doesn't really affect something that's already abnormal, right? You're already, and that's what I said, the second slide about more abnormal. We tend to think that, well, there's this, if you're male and then disabled, that creates a certain kind of experience or disadvantage. If you're female and disabled, well, those are two kinds of disadvantages, right? But when you don't have a subject that has humanity, then what does the deleterious category of disability actually do to that subject, right? The subject that is not taking anything away from, but actually functions within the dynamics of. And that's the question that I'm trying to answer.
Thank you. So Joe Wolf actually has a question, and I'll let him speak to it.
Thank you. So really fascinating talk. Thank you, Tommy. But my question concerns generalization and differentiation,
Sure.
and whether it is really possible to talk about the disabled black male body, in that some men are strong, some men are frail.
Hmm.
Could there be a difference in the way in which a threat appears because of the type of person and the type of disability? And I was also wondering whether your analysis is restricted only to physical disability, and
Hmm.
whether what Thomas Schramm has called minority minds, different types of cognitive limitation or mental disability, whether your analysis also extends in those ways. So I'm
Hmm.
wondering if we need more differentiation between different categories for the complete analysis.
Um, well, the thing is that when you're looking at black males, there's already an assumption of cognitive deficiency. Early IQ tests that were, prominent around the time of the bell curve asserted that black men were generally less intelligent than their female counterparts. So part of the idea of a non-intelligent black man has always been part of the racist caricatures that have existed. So when mental disability is introduced, and again, remember that the young man who was attacked in Idaho by the white men was mentally disabled, not physically disabled. There's still a particular way that the black male body is not allowed to express any kind of vulnerability. In the example, as you phrased it, there's a need for nuance in categories because a physical disability operates in a certain way, has certain kind of caricatures and stereotypes. Mental disability operates in a certain way because it has certain kind of features, stereotypes, etc. And what I'm suggesting is that when you take any one of those two categories and put it on a black male body, the black male body already contains the stereotypes that we think are operating or have a relationship to the categories we're speaking to. So what I'm asking is, in a question of mental instability or disadvantage or of deficiency, how does that operate on a black male who's already thought to be mentally deficient? And if we see that it leads to the exact same kinds of stereotypes, I'm not questioning whether or not there actually is a disability. I'm questioning whether or not the black male body can have a disability perceived given the negativity associated with the subject in the first place.
Thank you. That helps clarify. Thanks very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Sophia Jepson, who asks, do you think there are parallels to be drawn between how Black men are perceived and Foucault's writing about how mad people have been historically regarded as physically superhuman?
Mhm.
She's thinking of claims that madmen can't be hurt by heat or cold, for instance. They won't suffer hypothermia in cold buildings with little clothing like normal people will.
Absolutely, there's historically a relationship with what Foucault's talking about with madness and savagery. Generally, when you're talking about black men and these kinds of stereotypes, it comes to bear on the question of savagery, how close to nature they are, while they don't have certain feelings and certain ranges of temperament. It's interesting actually because if you're looking at what Foucault's saying, even about the history of sexuality, there's this very old, 1903, 1910 idea that the sexuality of black men operates very much like animals. So whereas humans can have sex year round, black men have sex because it's seasonal, right? They mate like animals, so they're not like humans in that regard. Um, so yes, I think that the constructions that we see both of madness and sanity around savagery and civilization operate very specifically on the black male body. And given that, given that, I think that we have to look at what disability or these other categories actually do, not on the norm that we're looking at what if we had a white man or a white female and how would they be disadvantaged, but rather in conditions of negation and dehumanization, how do categories that we take to be representative disadvantage further exemplify or magnify the kinds of things that we think are inhumane. Like, there's no reason that Mr. McDowell should have been shot appealing for help in a wheelchair. There's no reason that a black teenager should have been gang raped by a bunch of white men. There's no reason that someone, like Anna Stubblefield's victim, right, gets no attention or analysis or recognition as a victim of rape, right? So the question is, what is it about that body that is stopping us from taking disability and those power dynamics between able-bodied peoples seriously? And then what about that lack of humanity prevents any kind of emotive or philosophical access to recognition, humanity, and compassion? Right.
Thank you. Um, Navidev asks, I was wondering if your analysis contextualizes male crip queerness, especially with regards to HIV and AIDS and the allocation of resources.
Absolutely. I didn't think about the disabled queer body in relation to HIV, but I do quite a lot of work on HIV positive black men. And I think that in both situations, be they straight or gay, the stigma of hypersexuality is carried alongside HIV positive diagnoses, right? And that's not only in terms of how societal stigmas operate, right? About, oh, these black men are promiscuous, these black men are uneducated, these black men are dangerous, etc. But it also operates at the level of access to healthcare, certain stigmas about whether or not certain bodies deserve certain kind of innovations and whether or not they deserve treatment. In fact, I think one of the issues with Mr. Hickson, even though he doesn't identify as a queer black male body, is to just show the vacuity that that body has, the lack of quality of life that's presumed by the medical establishment. So when queer black men are operating within this kind of nexus of negation, where black men are traditionally thought to be, without meaning, absent of human life, not outside of our moral bounds, we could see how that kind of being operates within the same dynamics of negation. And I guess what I always talk about in my work is how do we adjust through policy, right? Because I don't think categories and ideas do the kind of work that we need. How do we adjust through policy, the kinds of or remedy through policy the kinds of disadvantages and prejudices that we see throughout the medical establishment? Because until we get to the point where we recognize that black maleness operates within this kind of register, right? Where there's always going to be negations, where there's never going to be equality, where there isn't the presumption of humanity, then we're just trying to stack categories upon categories, assuming that recognition is going to be part of the way to say, we can address this issue with the disabled queer black male, right? We do the same thing with queerness. We do the same thing with womanhood. I'm suggesting that no matter what you do, right, any black male subject is going to be negated because when you start looking at all their outcomes, be they straight, be they gay, be they disabled or not, you're still going to see downward trends compared to every other group. And there has to be something that's pulling those factors, those outcomes downward.
Thank you, Tommy. Luke Beasley asks how you feel your project interacts with previous analysis of simultaneous oppression within the disabled people's movement, particularly Aussie Stewart and Nasa Begum's, who read the specific gendered and racialized experiences of disability as structured by the social roles ascribed by racist societies to minority groups, particularly through discrimination in employment and state services.
Well, I think this is where my work was slightly different in the schema, right? Um, there's not a denial that there are multiple levels of disadvantage going on. What I would suggest is that when you compare, if you take all the disadvantaged groups, um, there seems to be downward trends associated with Black men and other racialized men in American society. So if I look at income differentials, you're going to see downward trends towards Black men, even more so than women in many cases. When you look at incarceration and unemployment, when you look at life expectancy, downward trend for Black males, right? If you're looking at perceptions of danger, right? Most white people in America view promiscuity, violence as being a Black male characteristic. So the question I'm asking is not so much how do we have simultaneous interactions between categories of subjugated identities, but rather why the most harsh and lethal forms of violence seem to accumulate around racialized males, specifically Black male bodies. So I can accept that there is a descriptive phenomenon being taken into account with the literature you mentioned. But when you look at some of the work like Leroy Moore, who's an activist, um, in comparison to some of the work I'm doing in Black male studies, my question is, what is it about the Black male body that leads to the most gruesome and lethal forms of violence imposed upon it? And once you've made that jump, what role then do categories like disability have, or what role does it play within that kind of dynamic?
It's interesting. Um, Kathleen Lennon asks, it seems to me to be an important corrective, or your talk seems to be an important corrective to some understandings of intersectionality.
Mhm.
Is it your view that the picture of the way in which multiple categories modify each other we often find in literature needs to take note of the fact that certain categories trump other possibilities, blocking such modifications?
I would agree with that. I don't know if the category trumps. I think that it's a question of grounding. Subjects seem to have certain possibilities, and I'll give you, if I may, a very concrete example of this. When white people enter into the zones of caricature, and in my work, caricature has a very specific meaning. It means that which is defined outside the human. So when it gets to caricature, those notions are expressed as dehumanization. So when we think about white people, we assume humanity, and then things that move them outside of humanity are dehumanized. When we look at Black people, there's already the condition of dehumanization there. But when you look at the kinds of propaganda for the last 200 years concerning dehumanization, that dehumanization usually targets racialized males of the particular group. So if you look at Nazi literature, you're going to find horrible notions of Jewish men as rapists. Some literature suggests that they're effeminate, so much so that they menstruate, that they carry disease like syphilis, right? You see the same thing for Armenian men. And of course, you know the kinds of racial stereotypes they've said about Black men for the last 200 years. What I'm suggesting is that intersectionality presumes that those kinds of things are understood through the interaction of categories, and that we've begun thinking about this not with the sociological or empirical condition of the bodies that form the group of Black men or Black women, et cetera, but we've used categories as a shortcut to talk about how some things and some meanings are formed, created, or as you suggest, could trump other things. What I'm saying is, if we look at the body from the actual history of the group, start with the empirical, historical fact, right, of what this group's been defined as, then categories don't seem to be able to do the kind of work that intersectionality promises. So if you look at Black men as a group historically, what they actually exist as in the United States and have for the last several hundred years, if you use maleness to be privilege, then you have to explain then why that group keeps having downward trends compared to its Black female counterpart. And we can't do that. So we just ignore that that's happening. And what I mean by that is very serious. So if you look at black men's rates of victimization of domestic violence, it's slightly higher than black women's in 12-month prevalence. If you look at their sexual victimization, made to penetrate violence, sexual contact, it's slightly higher than black women's in 12-month prevalence and all other groups of women in the United States. How do we explain that if we go through an intersectional lens? Because we don't associate sexual vulnerability with the category of maleness. And what I'm trying to show in my brief presentation is, but given what happened to the young man in Idaho, right? Given what happened to DJ with Anna Stubblefield, given what's happened to black men throughout history, sexual vulnerability is part of the male category. But you can't get to that point, right, in the intersectional analysis. You have to go outside, read some history, and then say, oh, part of the male category is, in fact, sexual vulnerability. Whereas I'm saying if we start with the historical group-based phenomena of black maleness, and we understand the negations that would be dehumanization in any other normative body, then that the group itself has already shown you that black maleness has a history of sexual vulnerability. So what happened to the young teenager in Idaho, the homoeroticism that drives police officers to stick batons, guns, etc., in black men's anuses, is part of the historical phenomena of anti-black racism when it's directed to the black male body. So I'm arguing that the categorical analysis that we get from intersectionality really cannot do the job. And we've always supplemented it by saying, let's just go outside the theory and then put the historical or sociological fact in the category. Whereas what we have to do is look at the circumstances, the abnormalities that have been historically present in the group that we're studying, and then use that as the basis of saying, well, how then do categories like disadvantage, like disability, poverty, et cetera, produce, operate, or further the dynamics of the group we've already observed?
Thank you. Um, Julie maybe asks, would you be willing to say something about how you might want to explain, for instance, that all of the black men who were killed in prisons in New York State last year were also disabled?
Yeah, I think that, again, I think that we're going to look at a disaggregation. So that means that, I'm sorry, I'm just kind of empiricist in that way. I think we look at what kind of violence is being driven towards them. Are there any stereotypes? Are there any antecedents to it? And then compare that to what we see generally across the nation, right? So we know, for instance, and it's a really good question, but I don't know if I would say disability would be a causal relationship in that sense, because when you look at the juvenile justice system, you see high prevalences of black boys sexually assaulted by staff of prisons, right? But that's despite mental capacity. Uh, so I think what we have to do is be very careful about whether or not we suggest that a certain category has a causal relationship to the phenomena. It just may be the case that the people that were killed happen to be disabled either physically or mentally. Does that, but that I want to say that in that way because I don't want to negate that disability does have a role in the dynamics of death and exploitation that we see. I'm not arguing that there is no effect. I'm simply saying that the effects are going to be indeterminate. They're not going to necessarily be predictable. And how we operate within them and analyze them is going to require empirical case study rather than starting with a category that says it operates in X way.
That's fair. If I might take moderator privilege and slide in here, would it be the case that given the constraints on how people with disabilities transact with the world, and to do some inside baseball, the ways that Black men learn to transact with the world to avoid particular kinds of police violence, could it be the case that particular modes of disability restrict Black men's capacity to adopt those habits, those behaviors, that would allow them to avoid particular kinds of state-sanctioned or police violence? And this might provide somewhat of an account for for what Julie is pointing to.
It's possible. And the reason I hesitate is because, I mean, when you're looking at, I guess it's a question of which way you do it from. So, I mean, you would have to start with the general population and then ask the question of which kinds of performances stop them from not being shot, right? And that's a big study, right? That's a big study. Because if you look at if you start from the victim perspective, the people that have been shot, you know that all their behaviors were ineffective, right? And I guess if we look at it that way, I mean, I think this year we're almost at 200 Black men shot. Like I think we're at 185, 189, and one Black woman shot. Um, we just don't know, right? Like, because if a Black man could walk across the street and be shot, or playing his music and be shot. Like we don't know which whistling Vivaldi right behavior is actually stopping the violence.
Mhm.
I certainly think it's possible. Again, what we know is there's a general death drive or death bound subjectivity towards black males, right? They experience some of the highest rates, the highest rate of police violence, highest rates of incarceration, highest rates of hate crime. So in all that, I guess my question would be, we just wouldn't know if the disabled behavior that was not able to be performed was causally linked to them being spared or not, because it seems to be random. What I do think we have to take note of is the way that disability has a particular meaning and stigma by the people with power that want to impose violence. So the reason that this young man was raped with a clothes hanger is because they saw his body as being vulnerable to a particular kind of violence, right? And I think that that's where we're going to have to go, because if we try to articulate disability on the black male body, notice I'm saying on the black male body, not in general. If we try to articulate this on the black male body, we're going to run into so many contradictory case studies, right? Where it seems so random because the black male body draws violence to it, that we won't be able to produce meaningful theory. So what I'm suggesting is, and this is I know contrary to Bell's thesis, is instead of looking at the marginalization effect that identity has, we have to look at the ways that the marginalization effect contributes to the already almost full glass of negativity that the black male body carries with it, right? And
Okay.
understand that in terms of its effects and consequences.
No, that's okay. Interesting. So there are two questions that have kind of an economic theme.
Okay.
Uh, so David Lawson asks, putting a economics of disability lens on, I wondered how you would understand class and disability and poverty as it pertains to black male oppression. And this is combined with Javier Camargo's question. Um, who would like to know about how income or money of a or possessed by a black person plays within the stereotypes and the recognition of humanity.
Those are good questions. I mean, the data is somewhat split here because you can be a middle class black man that still triggers fight or flight responses in a white man. So formidability theory says that no matter your class status, white men generally will perceive you as being bigger and more aggressive than your white counterpart with the same kinds of class or educational background. We know from Chetty and Hendren's work that despite where black men start in the economic ladder, um, you're going to have a trend towards downward mobility, which means that even if black men start in the upper middle classes, because of job discrimination, stereotypes about danger, economic discrimination, etc., they're going to tend to be to follow the class below them. So class operates around certain formulations and notions of black maleness that that are they're not independent of it. So me being a black male means that even if I have a high class status, I'm still subject to certain forms of discrimination, right? Livingston does this work with CEOs, how CEOs, black male CEOs still have to have baby faces and make jokes so that people don't think that they're dangerous deviants, right? Um, Race modifies the benefits that class would have. I don't think that in itself is new, but I think that when you're talking about the kinds of things that it has to modify for, like danger, the rape stereotype, the idea that black men are naturally more sexually predatory or misogynistic, right? These are the kinds of themes that don't seem to be affected by class. Class, if anything, seems to heighten that sensibility because it makes people think that black male is powerful. So it doesn't deter the kind of nature, the inclinations that people think happen to it. The first question, however, the one about, was it about economics and
Yes.
and and recognition? If I got that right.
Uh, yes. How you would understand? Yes.
Yeah. So how would I understand poverty as being part of the play for black men, disabled
Mhm.
black men, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Um. Again, it's strange. I so we know that within the conglomerate of poor black men are generally homeless, homeless, more unemployed than other groups of comparable status. We know disabled black men are particularly at risk for homelessness, disability, right, unemployment, etc. So it does in that case seem to have a magnifying effect, right? There is a cost to being disabled compared to other disabled groups, but that cost may be extremely marginal when you're looking at other poor able-bodied men in similar circumstances. I guess the question of disability in that regard would be the possibility to remedy one situation, right? Like whether or not there'll be more job discrimination, whether there be more social stigma associated with that. And ultimately, I think that that's just a question of how you're going to break down a case study or whatever data. The problem is philosophy, again, this is part of the issue with philosophy. Philosophy wants to make grandiose claims about how categories operate. And what I'm suggesting is we're giving causal effect to disability on bodies that are already experiencing the effect that's claimed to be the novel cause, right? So the kinds of discrimination, the kinds of invisibility, the kinds of dehumanization that have been traditionally linked to the disabled body are already operating on the racialized male body, especially the poor racialized male body. So disability is going to operate differently. It may magnify it, it may exacerbate it, but the content of that analysis are that body's already there. So I don't know what the cost versus benefit of that claim would be outside of just disaggregating disabled Black men and seeing if there's a difference in their experience with other poor, able-bodied homeless men.
Okay, thank you, Tommy. And I think so the next question we have is from Michael Brennan, who asks if your analysis is confined to the USA or does it extend to Caribbean countries and African nations?
The case studies I've utilized for disabled Black men are mostly from the United States. But the claims that I make about Black men and absence and negativity have applied to Black men all over diaspora. Specifically, the question of sexual victimization and violence in South Africa. So you see very similar rates of Black male victimization by older women and child sexual abuse in South Africa as you do in the United States. And I think, of course, this leads to the same kinds of vulnerabilities that we see with disabled Black men and boys specifically, right? Like, so we know that disabled Black boys are particularly at risk for sexual victimization, and they share that with their able-bodied male counterpart. But this seems to hold, at least in the United States and Africa. And a few of the Caribbean countries that I went to said they had similar problems, but they didn't have any data.
Thank you. So again, thank you, Tommy, for a enlightening presentation, and thank you all for attending. I believe we have a extended break, so Joe, if you want to take it away.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Tommy, particularly a wonderful talk and discussion. And I see things still going on in the chat as well, so maybe we could take a look at that. So my thanks to both of you.